We're going to start our web development journey here. In every section, you will learn something new about web development, and by the end of this course, you will put all of this together to build a beautiful web page. In this section, we're going to talk about the fundamentals of web development. You'll learn the languages and tools used in web development, as well as the key concepts and vocabulary such as URL, HTTP, DOM, and so on. We're also going to talk about how websites work, so you will understand what exactly happens under the hood when you use your browser to visit a website. You will also learn how to inspect network traffic using Chrome DevTools, which is a very powerful tool used by front-end developers. We'll also talk about the basics of HTML and CSS and validating web pages, which is something a lot of developers miss. This is going to be an awesome journey, so let's jump in and get started. This course is your first step towards becoming a web developer. So let me give you a simple roadmap to know where you are and where you should go next. Every website has two parts, a front end and a back end. The front end is the part that you see in your browser and interact with, all the visual aspects. The back end is the part that powers the front end. It's behind the scenes and it's mainly about storing data in databases and providing it to the front end. So web development jobs fall into three main categories: front-end development, back-end development, and full-stack development, which involves both front-end and back-end development. Front-end developers use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build front-ends. Back-end developers have different sets of tools available to them, which is outside the scope of this course. So let's talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. I know it's a mouthful, but basically we use HTML to define the building blocks of our web pages. CSS is short for Cascading Style Sheet and is used for styling web pages and making them beautiful. JavaScript is used for adding functionality to web pages. Let me give you an analogy. Think of a building. A building in the real world is like a web page on the internet. It has a skeleton or structure. It can have pretty walls, windows, and tiles, and it can have certain functionality. For example, when we press the elevator button, it comes to pick us up. Here's a real example. Let's say we want to build a website like Twitter. For each tweet, we want to have a layout like this. So first we use HTML to define all the building blocks of this layout. What are these building blocks here? An image, some text indicating the user's Twitter handle, another block of text containing the message, and three icons for commenting, retweeting, and liking the tweet. We use HTML to add these building blocks to our web page. Then we use CSS to give it visual effects. For example, with CSS, we can make the font bold, we can make our image round, we can add some padding around here, we can change the color of these icons and define their look when we hover over them. So CSS is all about aesthetics or visual effects. With CSS, we can also create beautiful animations. Now, most web pages these days are interactive. They respond to our actions like clicks and scrolls. This is where JavaScript comes in. With JavaScript, we can add functionality or behavior to our web pages. For example, we can like a tweet. So JavaScript is a programming language, while HTML and CSS are not, meaning we cannot use them to tell computers what to do. We use them to define the building blocks of our web pages and style them. Every web page you have seen on the internet is built with these three languages. So the better you learn and understand these languages and their features, the better you will be at front-end development. So your front-end development journey starts with HTML and CSS. I would say if you spend 3 to 5 hours every day studying and coding, you should be able to have a reasonable understanding of these two languages in about a month or a month and a half. Once you learn these languages, then you need to learn JavaScript. I have a separate series for learning JavaScript. So after finishing this series, you may want to enroll in that series. I would say learning JavaScript would probably take another 6 weeks of your time. Of course, you're not going to be a JavaScript expert in just 6 weeks, but you will have a reasonable understanding of it, and you will learn more as you work on different projects. So the first 3 months is all about the fundamentals. Now, building websites often include a bunch of repetitive tasks. This is where front-end frameworks and libraries come in. A framework or a library comes with a lot of code that we can reuse in our websites. So they help us get the job done faster. That's why a lot of companies these days use one of these popular frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue. Now, technically, React is not a framework, it's a library. But subtle distinction aside, all these tools serve the same purpose. They help us build applications faster. Now, you don't need to learn all of these to get started. Different companies use different tools for different projects. So as you move from one project to another, you may want to learn about the other tools. If you're starting out, just focus on React because it's the most popular tool in this space. Once you learn React, you can always learn the other tools if needed. For React, you would probably need 1 to 2 months. Again, I have a comprehensive course on React. More than 40,000 people have taken this course and loved it. All right, what's the next step? Version control systems. We use a version control system to keep track of our project history and work collaboratively with others. There are many version control systems out there like Git, Subversion, Mercurial, and so on. But Git is the most popular tool in this space and is used in more than 70% of software companies. That's why you'll see it in almost every job description. I would say you would probably need 2 weeks for learning Git. And again, I have a comprehensive course for you. So these are the essential skills that every front-end developer must have. You'll see these listed on almost every job description. Now, different jobs require other skills, but these skills vary from one company to another. So you can learn these additional things in the future or on the job. For now, just focus on these 4 skills or 4 steps. Remember, less is more. Don't try to learn too many things quickly. You won't learn anything. You'll just waste your time. All right, that's your roadmap. Next, we're going to talk about how the web works. Have you ever wondered how the web works? In this lesson, I'm going to tell you exactly what happens the moment you type the address of a website into your browser and hit enter. As part of this, we're going to talk about a few important concepts and terms that you need to know as a web developer. So let's say we launch our browser and head over to a website like codewithmosh.com. Now, this address that we have in the browser address bar is called a URL, which is short for Uniform Resource Locator. Basically, it's a way to locate a resource on the internet. Resources can be web pages, also called HTML documents. They can be images, video files, fonts, and so on. So we type the URL of a website and hit enter. What happens now? Well, there are 2 pieces involved here. The browser, also called the client, and the computer or computers that host our target website. We refer to these as web servers or servers for short. This is what we call the client-server model. The client requests a service, the server provides that service. So our browser sends a message to the server and says, hey, give me the homepage of this website. This is kind of similar to how you send your friend a text message. You can think of your phone as the client sending the message and your friend's phone as the server receiving the message. Now back to our example. This message is formatted based on a protocol called HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You've probably noticed it before but never knew what it is. In simple terms, HTTP is a language that clients and servers use to talk to each other. It's not a programming language, it's just a plain textual language for communicating over the internet. We also have HTTPS, which is HTTP with encryption. So the messages exchanged between the client and the server are encrypted. Here's a simplified example of an HTTP message. With this message, the browser tells the server what it's looking for. So on the first line, it says that it wants to get a page or a file called index.html using HTTP version 1.1. Index.html often represents the homepage of websites. On the second line, we can see the host, that is codewithmosh.com. And on the third line, we can see the language that the client can accept, in this case, English. Now, don't worry about memorizing any of this. All I want you to understand here is that this message is structured based on the HTTP protocol that clients and servers understand. So the server receives this message, it figures out what the client is asking, and then it will send a message back to the client. The first message is called an HTTP request, and the second message is called an HTTP response. Every data exchange using the HTTP protocol involves 2 messages, a request and a response. Now, what is in the response? Here's a simplified example. On the first line, we see the version of HTTP protocol used, followed by a number which is the status code. 200 means successful or OK. Right below that, we can see the date and time of the response. Next, we can see the type of content the server is sending back to the client, in this case, text/HTML. And after that, we can see the HTML code or the HTML document that represents the homepage of codewithmosh.com. Of course, the actual HTML code is way longer. Now, as the browser reads this HTML document, it constructs what we call a DOM or a document object model. Don't let this fancy name scare you. This is a model that represents the objects or elements in our HTML document. What are these elements? All the building blocks of our page, like paragraphs of text, images, links, and other stuff. You will see this in action in the next lesson. Now, as the browser is reading this HTML document that is returned from the server, it discovers references to other resources in this document, like images, fonts, and other stuff. Each of these resources has an address or a URL. So for each resource, the browser sends a separate HTTP request to the server to fetch that resource. Many of these HTTP requests are sent in parallel, so we can see the page as quickly as possible. Once the browser has all the necessary resources, it will render the HTML document. Rendering an HTML document means displaying it. It's a fancy technical term we use often. So in a nutshell, our browser sends an HTTP request to the server and receives an HTTP response. This HTTP response contains an HTML document. The browser reads that HTML document to construct a document object model and render the page. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you all of these steps in action. All right, let's see HTTP requests and responses in action. So open up Chrome and head over to google.com. Now we need to access Chrome DevTools. This is a very powerful tool used by front-end developers. So on the top, we go to View, Developer, Developer Tools. Now look at the shortcut. On Mac, it's Alt or Option, Command, and I. On Windows, it's obviously different, but remember the shortcut because it's much faster to access the DevTools via the keyboard. So here's the DevTools. The first time you see it, it might appear a bit intimidating, but trust me, it's much easier than you think. Throughout the course, you're going to learn more about the DevTools. So here we have a few different tabs: Elements, Console, Sources, Network, and so on. In this demo, we're going to go to the Network tab so we can inspect the network traffic to and from google.com. Now, by default, DevTools is docked to the bottom of the screen. We can dock it to the left, to the right, or undock it as a separate window. So over here, we can dock it to the left side. A lot of front-end developers like this layout. So they put DevTools on the left side and they have their website on the right side. Now in this demo, I'm going to undock it as a separate window so we have more space to work with. So let's undock it. Good. Now we need to refresh our website. As you can see over here, on Mac, we can press Command and R. On Windows, it's probably Control and R. Alternatively, we can go back to this window and press the refresh button. Now, back to the DevTools, look at all these items over here. These are the HTTP requests that are sent from our browser to google.com. As you can see, there are totally 45 requests, and here's the amount of data transferred over the network. So in this case, just over 94 kilobytes. Now look at the first item in this list. This is the first HTTP request that Chrome sent to google.com. As you can see, with this request, the browser wanted to get a document, and the status of this request is 200, which means OK. Over here, you can see the amount of data transferred over the network for this request and the time it took to get the response. Now, if we click on this request, we can see more details about it. So here on the Headers tab, we can see all the headers of our request and response. So here are some general headers like request URL, request method, which is get, status code, that is 200, we talked about it, remote address, this is the numeric representation of google.com. Now down below, we have response headers. There's so many headers here, you don't have to worry about them. But as an example, look at content type. We talked about this in the previous lesson. So the type of this response is text/HTML. Below that, we have the date and time of the response. Now, if we click on the preview tab, we can see a preview of the HTML document that is returned from the server. So this is the home page of Google. Now, in this HTML document, we have references to other resources like images, fonts, and so on. So all these subsequent requests are sent to download those resources. So right below the first request, we have a request for downloading a PNG or an image file. Here's another request for getting another image. We have 2 requests for getting 2 different fonts and so on. Now we can easily filter this list. So let's click on the filter icon here. By default, we see all requests, but we can filter by request type. For example, we can select doc to see requests for downloading HTML documents, or font to see the requests that were sent to download fonts and so on. Next, I'm going to show you how to create your first HTML document. All right, first things first. Here on your desktop or anywhere on your computer, right-click and create a new folder. I'm going to call this HTML, but we could call it anything. Now, let's go back to VS Code and open the Explorer panel. Then we go to Open Folder and open the folder that we just created. Good. Now, this folder is currently empty, so let's add a new file here called index.html. As I told you before, index.html often represents the homepage of websites. So let's go with that. Now we can close the Explorer panel by pressing Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. Good. Now, the first thing we need to do here is to tell the browser that this is an HTML5 document. So we type a left angle bracket. Now look at this suggestion list. The first item here is doc type or document type. Let's press Enter or Tab. VS Code generated this piece of code for us. So with this line of code, we can tell browsers that this is an HTML5 document. This line of code here is called doc type declaration. In the previous versions of HTML, our doc type declaration was so long, it was so messy, but HTML5 solved this problem. So all we have to type is doc type HTML. And by the way, HTML is not a case-sensitive language, which means it's not sensitive to uppercase and lowercase letters. But conventionally speaking, we type everything in lowercase except doc type. This is just a convention. We could type this in lowercase, and that's perfectly fine. So let's revert it back. Now, right after this, we need to use our HTML elements to define the structure of this web page. The first element we're going to use is the HTML element. So we type HTML and then press Tab or Enter. Once again, VS Code generated this piece of code for us. So what we have here on the left side is called the opening tag, and what we have on the right side is the closing tag. So most HTML elements have an opening and a closing tag, but there are exceptions, as I'm going to show you later in this video. Now, inside this element, we're going to add additional elements. Now, because I don't want to type everything in one line, I'm going to press Enter. That's better. Now here we're going to add 2 elements, head and body. So once again, we type head, press Tab, good, and then body. We use the head element to give browser information about this page. For example, here we can use the title element to specify the title of this page that appears in the browser over here. So let's type my first web page. Now let's save the changes by pressing Command and S on Mac or Control and S on Windows. Good. Now before going any further, let's right-click somewhere and go to Open with Live Server. So we're going to open this page using the development server that we just installed. Okay. All right, take a look. So our page is currently empty because we haven't added any elements inside this page. And over here, we can see the title that we just typed, my first web page. Now look at the URL or address of this page. We have 127.0.0.1. This number or this IP address represents the local computer. It's globally known, so everybody knows 127.0.0.1 references the current computer. After that, we have a colon, and then we have the port number on which our web server is listening. So our web server is waiting for HTTP requests on this port, okay? Then we have a / followed by the name of our file, index.html. Now, back to VS Code. Inside the body element, we're going to add elements that would appear on our page. So let's say we want to display a tweet. What elements do we need here? An image, and some text elements. So we type img, short for image, and then press tab. Here's our image element. Now this image element is different from the other elements we have created so far. Can you tell the differences? There are two differences here. The first difference is that here we don't have a closing tag. We only have an opening tag because the image element cannot have any child elements. That's the reason. Now in the previous versions of HTML, we used to add a / here, and this represents a self-closing tag. But we don't have to do this in HTML5, so I'm going to keep the code simpler. Now, here we have two attributes, source and alt. With these attributes, we can supply additional information about an element. So we use the source element to specify the path to our image. So let's open up the Explorer panel one more time by pressing Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. Here I'm going to create a new folder called Images. Now for this demo, I'm going to use my own image, which you can also download right below this video, but you can use any image that you want. So here's my image. I'm going to drop it onto the images folder. It's right here, okay? Now let's close this window. Good. So where is this image relative to our index.html file? It's inside the images folder, right? So here in double quotes, we type images/mosh.jpg. Now VS Code is suggesting this name, so we can press tab to complete the code. Beautiful. Now alt is short for alternative text, and we use this attribute to give the browser some text to display in case the image cannot be displayed. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, I'm going to delete this attribute. Good. Now after the image, we're going to add a text element. So we type P, that is short for paragraph, tab, and here we can type my Twitter handle. So @MoshHamedani. After that, we're going to add another text element. And here we can type the body of our tweet. So I love to teach you HTML. Perfect. Save the changes. Now back in the browser, our page refreshed automatically. This is one of the beauties of Live Server. So we don't have to manually refresh the page every time we make changes. Now, look at what we have here. So we have my image, and right below that, we have two text elements. Take a look. Unfortunately, they're not very visible. Obviously, this doesn't look like a tweet because we haven't applied CSS yet. As I told you before, we use HTML to define the structure or the building block of our web pages. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to apply CSS so our page looks kind of like a real tweet. All right, now let's see how we can use CSS to improve the look and feel of this page. Look at our head element. Currently, we have a single element inside the head element. That is our title element, right? Now, after the title, we're going to add another element called style. This is where we're going to write our CSS code. So in between style tags, we're going to write a bunch of CSS rules. First, we're going to work on this image. Our image is currently too big. So let's make it a bit smaller. Back to VS Code. Over here, we're going to type img to reference our image element. Then we type a pair of curly braces. And inside the braces, we write one or more CSS declarations. Each declaration contains a property and a value. So here we can set the width property to, let's say 100 pixels. So we type the property, colon, and then the value. And then we terminate this line using a semicolon. So we can write multiple CSS declarations. Now let's save the changes. Back in the browser, our image looks smaller. That's a lot better. But look at the edges. The edges are so sharp. I would like to make them a bit round so they appear softer. Now back to our rule. Here we're going to set the border-radius property to, let's say 10 pixels. Now don't worry about memorizing any of these properties. We're going to go over them several times throughout the course. In this lesson, I just want you to get a sense of what it's like to use CSS, okay? So save the changes. Now look, the edges are round and look softer. Now let me show you a trick. If we set border radius to a value that is half of the width, we will get a round image. So I'm going to set this to 50 pixels. And here's the result. That's a lot better. Now our elements are stacked vertically. I want the image to be pushed to the left side. So let's set the float property to left. This will push the image element to the left side of our text elements. Take a look. So that's a lot better, but our image is so close to the text. I want to add some space after the image. So here we use another property called margin-right. We can set it to 10 pixels. Save, and that's a lot better. Now let's make the username bold. So we're going to repeat one more time. This time we're going to apply a rule to our paragraph element. So here we're going to set the font-weight property to bold. Take a look. See what happened? Both our text elements are bold. But what if you want to apply this style only to the username? Well, we have to separate these two paragraph elements. So I'm going to give the first paragraph element an attribute called class. So class equals double quotes. Class is short for classification, and we can use this attribute to put this element inside a different class or a different category, just like the products in a supermarket. In a supermarket, we have products in different categories, right? So I'm going to put this paragraph element inside a class or inside a category called username. And then I'm going to change this rule. So this rule is currently applied to all paragraph elements, but I want it to be applied only to paragraph elements with the username class. So right after P, we type .username. Now we can also remove P, and this rule will apply to all elements that have the username class, whether they are paragraph elements or other types of elements. Okay, now save the changes and take a look. So that's a lot better. So this is CSS in action. As you can see, CSS has a different syntax or a different grammar than HTML. Throughout the rest of the course, you're going to learn both these languages in detail. Next, I'm going to show you how to format your code using Prettier. One thing you need to know about browsers is that they ignore white spaces in HTML and CSS code. For example, I can put all these elements on a single line, and everything still works. Let me show you. So save the changes. Back in the browser, we have the same result as before. Because browsers don't care how we format our code. But formatting is very important when it comes to reading and maintaining code. We want our code to be beautiful and perfectly formatted, just like an article. This is where we use the Prettier plugin. With Prettier, we can format our code in a consistent fashion. This is super important when you're part of a team, because different people have different ways of formatting their code. But if everyone on the team uses the Prettier plugin, the code will be consistently formatted. So let me show you how to use Prettier. On the top, we go to the View menu. Look at the shortcut for the command palette. On Mac, it's Shift, Command, and P. On Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and P. So let's bring up the command palette. And here we search for Format Document. Now we press Enter. We get this message saying there are multiple formatters for HTML files. Select the default formatter to continue. The reason we're getting this message is that VS Code by default comes with a formatter for formatting HTML files, but we have installed Prettier, which is a separate formatter. So let's go to Configure and tell VS Code to use Prettier to format HTML and CSS files. Okay, now Prettier formatted my code, so none of those elements are on the same line. This is a lot better. But let me show you a trick. We don't want to format our code every time we make a change. So we can configure VS Code to automatically format the code the moment we save the changes. So on the top, let's go to the Code menu, then Preferences and Settings. And here, search for Format and Save. Here's the setting. Let's enable this setting. Now, every time we save the changes, VS Code automatically formats our code using Prettier. Earlier, we talked about the DOM or Document Object Model. I told you that when the browser reads the HTML document that is returned from the server, it constructs a Document Object Model. Now let me show you this Document Object Model in action. So once again, we're going to use Chrome DevTools. The shortcut on Mac is Shift, Command, and I. On Windows, it's probably Shift, Control, and I. I'm not really sure. So let's open up DevTools. Now in this lesson, we're going to look at the Elements tab. Now what we have here on the left side is our document object model. So we see the same elements that we created earlier in the course. We have the HTML element, head, body, and so on. But we have some additional elements that are injected by live server. For example, we have the script element and 2 divs. Don't worry about these. These are purely used by live server, so it automatically reloads our page. Now we can hover over any of these elements, and you can see that element highlighted on the screen. Now we can click an element, and on the right side, we can see the styles applied to this element. So look at the styles we defined for the image element, width, border radius, and so on. We can enable or disable these styles. So we can disable the width property, and now our image is big. We can bring it back. We can also change its value. So we can set it to, let's say, 50 pixels. Now our image is smaller. We can use the up and down arrows to change this value. This is pretty handy. So a lot of front-end developers use DevTools to play with these styles and get the look they want. Once they figure out the exact styles and their values, then they apply them in the code. Now, one more thing. Over here, you can see where these styles have been applied. So in index.html on line 6, we can click on this link, and this takes us to the exact line of code where we wrote that style. Now we're currently on the Sources tab, so we can go back to Elements and inspect other elements. So this is the basics of inspecting elements using DevTools. We're going to talk about this in more detail in the future. The last thing we're going to cover in this section is validation. So as we write code, we may run into problems. If you have a typo in our code or don't use the right syntax or grammar, our web pages may not look as expected. In these situations, we can use a validator to identify the potential errors in our code. Like currently, we don't have any problems on this web page. It looks perfectly fine to me, but let's run it by the standard HTML validator. So we go to validator.w3.org. This is a standard markup validation service. We have 3 methods for validating our HTML markup. We can validate by an address if our website is live on our internet, but this doesn't work for us because our website is currently hosted locally in our development server. So this IP address that we have over here, 127.0.0.1, this is a local IP address. So no one else can access our website. So here we have 2 other methods. We can validate by file upload or by direct input. In this case, I'm going to go with file upload. So let's upload our index.html file and check. So look, we have 1 warning and 2 errors. The warning is saying that we haven't added the lang or language attribute to the HTML start tag. This is a common best practice because with this, we can tell search engines what is the language of this web page, so they can do a better job at displaying the results. This is very easy to fix. So here's our HTML tag. We're going to add the lang attribute and set it to EN, which is short for English. Now, what is next? We have an error saying the character encoding was not declared. Don't worry about this. We'll talk about this in the next section. So let's look at the second error. It's saying that an image element must have an alt attribute. So earlier we had this alt attribute. I told you that we use the alt attribute to provide a description for our image. So if the image cannot be displayed, the alternative text will be displayed. Again, we're going to talk about the alt attribute in more detail in the future. So back to our code. Let's fix this error real quick. Here's our image tag. Let's add the alt attribute. And for the description, I'm going to say an image of Mosh Hamedani. Now save the changes. Let's re-upload the file and validate it one more time. Okay, this time we have only a single error, and that has to do with character encoding, which we're going to talk about in the next section. So this is all about HTML validation. Now for CSS, we have a different validator. So we go to jigsaw.w3.org/CSS-validator. Now you don't have to memorize this address. Simply go to Google and search for CSS validator. Here's the first link. So we have the same interface. We can validate our CSS code using an address or by file upload or direct input. Now, in this case, we have embedded all of our CSS code inside our HTML markup. But as our web pages get more complex, we want to separate our CSS code into separate files so our code is better organized. We'll talk about this in more detail in the future. So for now, I'm going to copy all of our CSS code and then go to the third tab, paste it over here, and validate it. So we don't have any errors. Everything's perfect. So this is all about validation. Validation is very important. If your web pages aren't displayed as expected, always start with a quick validation because this can often point you in the right direction. All right, that brings us to the end of this section. In the next section, we're going to explore HTML in more detail.